When it comes to any sort of a competitive game, finding a state of balance is incredibly important. More than arguably any other factor, a game's state of balance is what determines its competitive viability, and it's the responsibility of developers to ensure that the game maintains a healthy competitive scene by implementing necessary balance changes and bug fixes. Unless it's Smash, where balance is self-imposed by tournaments and competitive orgs because Nintendo hates them. The problem is, while balance is essential, it's also incredibly difficult to achieve. It's rare that a complex game reaches a state of genuine balance in the community's eyes, even momentarily, let alone for an extended period of time. And it's worth asking why that's the case. What makes it so hard to balance a video game? Also, before we start, a couple quick channel things. First thing, thank you for the very positive response to the last couple of videos, particularly the video about the study I did into the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm going to be doing more studies in the future, so if you'd like to participate, be sure to subscribe and keep an eye out for community posts with new surveys. Second, channel memberships are now active. Memberships are $5 and come with badges that show up in the comments, some extra emotes, shoutouts and videos, and the opportunity to help decide on future video topics. On the first day of every month going forward, I'm going to be putting up a poll with a handful of video ideas for members to vote on, and whichever one they select by the 10th of the month will be the second video for that month. These polls are going to be a bit of a mix between more typical topics for this channel as well as some that are a bit more out there. For example, for April, members will be deciding between 4 videos that are tentatively titled 1. The politics of ping and performance, which will focus on how the past and present politics of different countries affect things like your ping and the broader competitive esports scenes in those countries. 2. Overwatch's Omnics or shallow storytelling, which will focus on how Blizzard's approach to the Omnics doesn't work and compare it to other media like Detroit Become Human and Ender's Game to see what does and doesn't work about this kind of media. 3. 999 Made Me Hate the Titanic and Telepathy, which will be about the importance of editing and consistent character development when it comes to storytelling in games. And 4. Against the Storm in game genres, which will look at Against the Storm and see how its weird existence as a roguelike city builder works and what that might say about how we perceive genres in video games compared to music, movies, or TV shows. If you'd like to have a say in which of those 4 becomes a video, be sure to click on the join button below or go to youtube.com/@thevivaros/join. Usually polls are going to open on the first of the month, but given that this is the first month of memberships, I'm going to be opening up the poll for the April video right after this one goes up, so people who get March memberships still get to have a say in it. New emotes, badges, and perks will also be added over time, and the support is really appreciated. Alright, self-promo out of the way, let's get to the topic at hand. Starting with Part 1, Complexity and Butterflies. Video games aren't the only type of competition where balance changes have had to happen. While they're not usually referred to as a balance change in sports, they happen there as well. For example, back when I was a kid, I was a hockey referee for a few years while I played, and during my time as a ref and player, the Alberta Minor Hockey League added a new class of penalties for head contact. While you were never allowed to just wail on someone's skull before the rule change, the new rules added it as its own specific penalty. This included the specific conditions of the penalty, a new gesture to indicate the type of penalty, and minor and major variants. This is, in effect, a balance change in hockey. New rules were in play and players had to adjust their behavior to make sure they could succeed under those new rules. The difference between a lot of traditional sports and competitive games compared to video games is just how insanely complex a video game can get, especially when you consider that video games don't have to rely on real-world physics, logic, or human physical limitations. In Overwatch, for example, a good Widowmaker can wipe out 80% of an enemy team in under 10 seconds and just win a team fight. If you try that in football, good luck, that football game is over now. A goalkeeper in soccer doesn't have to worry about the striker pulling out an ultimate ability that'll let them score 3 easy goals at once, and basketball players can't use a rocket jump to dunk on each other. Traditional sports benefit from there only being so much that the human body can do, and traditional games like chess benefit from things like strict turn orders and consistency in terms of the abilities present for both teams. It's a consequence of the fact that these are games that need to be judged by human beings. Games like Overwatch or League of Legends or Valorant only work the way that they do because the process of judging outcomes can be automated by a computer. For more on that, see the video that I did on Overwatch 2's issues with feedback. And to be clear, that's not a criticism, that's part of the fun of an esport that you can't get in any other type of competitive environment. It's not better or worse, it's just unique. It can be really exciting to play a game where there's a million things happening all at once and you have to try and manage people teleporting or being hit with black holes or turning into King Kong, and it can be equally exciting to watch people who are really good at managing all those things. However, it also creates unique challenges for balancing a video game, because there's so much going on that it can be hard to isolate and fix specific problems. With the hockey example from before with head contact penalties, minor hockey leagues were facing a problem. A whole lot of concussions and head injuries, and they decided that introducing harsher penalties for head contact would incentivize players to be more careful about it, but should reduce the number of head injuries. When it comes to a video game, on the other hand, isolating that problem can be a lot harder. In Season 2 of Overwatch 2, most people recognized that Roadhog and Sojourn were problems, but the difficulty is in assessing what the actual problem was. Was it that the abilities of those heroes were just busted, or was it that Overwatch 2 reduced the number of barriers and CC abilities that would have helped prevent those characters from being quite so oppressive? If it's the former, how do you actually fix Roadhog's hook to make him less oppressive, or fix Sojourn's railgun to make it less overpowered? It can be easy to get it wrong. For example, in an old video that I did about Sombra and Balance, I argued that the nerfs that she received in the first season would make her worse to play but wouldn't actually address the issues that people had with her being annoying and hard to secure kills on. In my opinion, probably the best example of this is Brigitte, who was pretty consistently being nerfed for years after her release, but never really got to a good place because they couldn't find a way to fix the problem. The other challenge when it comes to something as complex as Overwatch is that every balance decision has a butterfly effect on the entire rest of the game that can be hard to predict or accommodate. Introducing a penalty for head contact in hockey doesn't suddenly change the role of the left winger in a game, but introducing a nerf to an Overwatch hero can absolutely make a different hero more viable. When Sojourn's railgun shot was nerfed to no longer be a one-shot kill on 200 HP targets in Season 2, it led to Mercy becoming a way more viable pick because a pocketed Sojourn could still secure those kills. Mercy becoming more viable meant that one of the meta supports from Season 1, which were Kiriko or Lucio, would have to be replaced. If Lucio went, then the team would be without, speed boosts during regular play and a sound barrier as a defensive ult, but if Kiriko went, the team would be left without Suzu to cleanse status effects or Kitsune Rush. Regardless of which heroes are involved, there's always going to be a ripple effect because how their abilities interact with each other in the game's maps. Any buff to Wrecking Ball that makes them more viable will also make Sombra more viable, and if Sombra becomes more viable, then maybe Kiriko and Ana become more viable because Suzu can cleanse hacks and Sleep Darts can help deal with both Sombra and Wrecking Ball. And if Kiriko and Ana become the dominant support meta, then there's no room for Mercy, and if there's no room for Mercy, then Sojourn's viability takes a hit, and on and on and on. Even when developers try to accommodate for something like this, it can be hard to predict the outcome. A common expression about games is that gamers will always try to find a way to optimize the fun out of a game if given the chance, and that is especially true in a competitive scene. A lot of people have a lot riding on being able to find the best new meta in a competitive game, and are pretty aggressively incentivized to find which combination of 5 characters is the strongest in Overwatch or Valorant or League, in order to guarantee the best possible odds of success. Developers not only have to try and predict what the likely consequences of any change would be, but all possible consequences. No matter how unlikely an outcome might seem on paper, you still have to account for the slight chance that someone stumbles upon it and ends up breaking your game for 3 months. In a lot of cases, this kinda understandably leads to developers being slow to act on balance issues. They need to make sure that they've identified the correct core problem, or else any solution they implement will be flawed because it's based on a flawed foundation, and they need to be sure that the solution that they implement won't create a new problem. This creates especially big challenges when the balance issue that they're facing is the direct result of a past attempt to change the state of balance, because the developer can't just walk it back. After all, the change happened for a reason, and the developer has to try and make a call between trying to rush a solution versus letting it play out for a while to try and gather the data necessary to make a better decision. And as this channel has discussed before, it's not enough to just gather the data. A lot of work has to go into properly analyzing the data to come to a workable solution. And it's really easy to fall into fallacies in data analysis that lead to inaccurate assumptions and balance decisions that don't fix problems. As I mentioned, I already have a video talking about the problem with Overwatch 2's feedback, but it's important to consider that many of those same issues can be applied to the developer side of things as well. There's way too much feedback to account for all of it, so how do you decide what to prioritize or what conclusions to derive? And hey, maybe the problem will solve itself if players are given enough time to build some counter strategies. Good luck with that. Part 2. What kind of game are the devs trying to make? So far, a lot of the video was kind of implicitly operated on the assumption that balance is something that can be either objective or universal, that even if we can't fully define it or explain it for ourselves, there's gotta be some theoretical objective state of balance for a game. However, it's important to recognize that this isn't really true. Balance is one of those things where there are definitely wrong answers, but not necessarily right answers. The old Moth meta in Overwatch 1 was a wrong answer to the question, how do we rework Mercy in a way that gets rid of the big res, that ended up making pretty much nobody happy, and no reasonable person would argue that it was healthy for the game, but the fact that those reworks are still facing criticisms more than half a decade later demonstrates how hard it can be to come up with the right answer for a balance problem. This is especially true when we consider that Overwatch is a bit of a Pandora's box. When something is introduced, it's rarely an option to just unintroduce it. If a character is introduced to the game whose kit turns out to be just a pretty overwhelming net negative for the game, they can't just be removed. And I don't mean this to rag on Brigitte mains or anything like that, but Overwatch 1 probably would have been a healthier game if she hadn't been introduced, but once she was released, they couldn't unrelease her. They had to try to fix her from within the game, and they weren't really able to do that. Different people will argue that different abilities or heroes should never have been introduced to Overwatch, with common targets being heroes who bring either a whole new playstyle to the game like Sombra or Doomfist, or specific abilities that don't have straightforward counters like Ana and Junker Queen's anti-heal did pre-Kiriko. I think part of why this is especially common with the DLC heroes is because each new one forces us to reevaluate the question of what kind of game is Overwatch supposed to be, in some capacity. Ana, Sombra, Orisa, Doomfist, Moira, Brigitte, Wrecking Ball, Ashe, Baptiste, Sigma, Echo, Sojourn, Junker Queen, and Kiriko, and Ramatra all brought something new to the game and their respective roles when they were released. Whether it was a brand new mechanic, a new implementation of an existing mechanic, or a new combination of several existing mechanics. The original 21 heroes are the best baseline we have to work off of for determining what Overwatch was originally supposed to be and the game that Blizzard was trying to make, even if that obviously wasn't the completed vision given that Overwatch kept releasing new heroes. And the reason this is important is because that skews what we consider to be part of the game as it is, or as it should be. Would people feel differently about Sombra if she'd been one of the original 21 heroes instead of Tracer? What if Overwatch didn't launch with either of its snipers and only added Hanzo and Widow in later? What if Overwatch 1 had launched with an even balance of its roster with 7 tanks, 7 supports, and 7 damage heroes as they're currently defined, instead of 5 tanks, 3 supports, and 13 damage heroes like it did? All of this is to emphasize how hard it is to answer the question, what kind of game are the devs trying to make? What kind of playstyles does Blizzard want to reward? What does it want to include? What kind of gameplay do they see as optimal for Overwatch's future? What's their goal with the game in terms of the experience they want people to have? Should the game be fast-paced and chaotic? Should it be slow-paced and methodical? Should there be one-shot abilities, stealth abilities, get-out-of-jail-free abilities, CC abilities, or movement abilities? And if yes to any or all of those, then to what extent? I feel like this is getting a little bit too abstract for my liking, so let's compare the existence of 2 separate mechanics, invisibility and knockback. Invisibility is only available as a mechanic to Sombra, or Echo if she clones as Sombra. The fact that invisibility exists in the game tells us that Blizzard thinks that stealth mechanics like that are a part of their vision for the game they're trying to make, but the fact that it's a unique ability to Sombra indicates that Blizzard wants Overwatch to be a game where stealth isn't a major component, and that they view it as a specific part of a specific hero's kit rather than a general gameplay mechanic. Sombra's kit relies on having a bunch of unique mechanics that don't exist anywhere else in the game, which collectively let us know that Blizzard only sees invisibility as a part of their vision for the game in the context of Sombra. In contrast, tons of heroes have knockback abilities. Ashe, Bastion, Brigitte, D.Va, Doomfist, Junkrat, Kiriko, Lucio, Orisa, Pharah, Reinhardt, Roadhog, Sigma, Winston, Wrecking Ball, and Zenyatta all have a specific straight-up knockback mechanic in their kit, while Soldier 76 and Zarya both also get minor knockback from their alt fires, Junker Queen's Knife can have a similar effect but with a pull rather than a push, and Echo can obviously take on all these heroes and their respective knockback abilities. Of the 36 heroes currently in Overwatch, 16 have a straight-up knockback mechanic in their kit, with 4 others having some knockback capacity or something, at least similar in concept. Even if you remove Junker Queen and Echo, since I think they're the weakest examples of it for our purposes, that's fully half the roster with some ability to knock you back in their kit. Knockback isn't unique to a specific hero, a specific role, or even a specific implementation. Some heroes like D.Va and Wrecking Ball ram into their targets to knock them around, while others get increased knockback effects from their melee like Reinhardt or Zenyatta. Some heroes have to get up close and personal to knock someone back like Winston or Lucio, while others can launch a knockback projectile. And even within that, there's a lot of variety in the category. Orisa's Javelin, Kiriko's Suzu, and Junkrat's Confession Mine are all arcing projectiles that have a knockback, but Orisa's and Junkrat's both deal damage while Kiriko's doesn't. And Kiriko's and Junkrat's are explosive AoE abilities, while Orisa's requires a direct hit on a target. Junkrat's knockback can also affect himself, which doesn't apply to the other two, while Kiriko's can also be used to cleanse and heal allies and herself, which doesn't apply to Junkrat or Orisa. And Orisa's knockback deals bonus damage if she causes the target to hit a wall, which isn't shared with either of the other two in this category, but is shared with Doomfist. All of this is to say that when we're talking about that question from earlier, we can see that Blizzard considers knockback to be a pretty fundamental part of what the game should be. That Overwatch should be a game where you can push other people around, and that you should be prepared to get knocked around a bit in a typical Overwatch match. So, when we consider these two mechanics in combination, we can start to feel out what kind of game Blizzard is trying to build. One where invisibility and general stealth mechanics are rare and only implemented in a specific context, while knockback abilities that move other heroes around are common and should be expected. If you're someone who hates games with knockback, Overwatch is pretty openly telling you that this isn't being built for you. You might still enjoy it, but you're gonna have to learn to live with the knockback. If you hate games with stealth mechanics, you won't have to deal with them very often, and only in the specific context of the enemy team picking a Sombra. The problem is that whenever a new hero is added and brings a new mechanic to the table, we're forced to either reject it out of principle because it doesn't match with the answer we have in our heads for what kind of game this is supposed to be, or we have to reject our old answers and start again. Even without a new hero being added, any balance change that affects how rewarding different mechanics and playstyles are both in isolation and relative to every other mechanic and playstyle forces us to reconsider this stuff. Is Overwatch a game where the translocator should exist? Up until recently, the devs have said yes, but if the rumors are true, then Sombra won't have it for much longer. If that changes, then we have to reevaluate what kind of game Blizzard is trying to make. Should it be one with escape abilities? If yes, in what context? Given that hack, invisibility, and translocator currently only exist in a single kit in harmony with one another, how does that change the vision Blizzard has for this game when it comes to those abilities? And you might kind of be asking, like, what does any of this have to do with balance? Because it feels like this has been a bit of a tangent. The answer is that determining what balance even is first requires understanding what the game is trying to be. Without that, we're left trying to evaluate balance without a rubric. It's like trying to judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree without even identifying what tree we want it to climb. Blizzard theoretically could just come out and say, alright, here is exactly the vision we have for the game, here's what we do and don't want to prioritize, and here's the ideal implementation we're envisioning for every single mechanic in the game, but that would obviously be extremely hard because there's a lot of variety in the game. After all, it's a hero shooter. By design, there's meant to be a whole lot of variety, and each character is gonna bring something else to the table because they're meant to. All we can really do is go off of what Blizzard has given us and work from there. If it's in the game, we can assume it's part of Blizzard's vision for Overwatch's ideal state of balance, at least in some capacity. If it isn't, we have to assume that it either isn't part of their balance vision or just isn't yet. Part of why this is an issue is because as players, we don't have a shared understanding of what an ideal Overwatch game is meant to look like, and that's true of a lot of competitive video games in a way that isn't necessarily shared with a lot of other types of competition. Sports like football, hockey, and baseball are conceptually straightforward enough that it can be a lot easier to see what the vision is that their respective governing bodies have for them. Games like chess or darts are similarly conceptually straightforward enough that you can understand what place each mechanic is meant to have in the game. If two hockey fans get into an argument about, I don't know, whether or not slap shots are good for the game, they still both generally share a core understanding of what the game is meant to be and the context that slap shots exist within. If two Overwatch players are arguing over whether or not hard CC abilities are good for the game, they don't necessarily share a core understanding of what kind of game Overwatch is trying to be with each other or with the developers, which makes it really hard in a lot of contexts to even discuss balance, let alone come to a good conclusion. And I know some people think that all I like to do is rag on Blizzard, so I want to make it clear that this isn't a dig at them. This is not an easy question to answer for game devs of any game, and while I think there are a lot of wrong answers to balance questions, there aren't necessarily right ones, especially for a game that's as mechanically broad and diverse as Overwatch. However, let's just assume that none of that's a problem. We can all agree on what Overwatch is trying to be and what it would mean for the game to be balanced. Would that solve the problem? Part 3. The tendency towards meta. When we're talking about balance, we inevitably have to talk about the meta, the default top-tier heroes, team comps, or strategies that define how the game is being played at any point. The meta is a weird concept because it's only implicitly imposed upon players by the developers. In fact, based on how Blizzard generally tries to balance the game, it seems pretty clear that they don't want there to just be a single dominant meta forever and ever, in terms of either specific heroes or specific compositions becoming essential picks or near essential picks if a team wants to be viable. And yet, that's usually where we end up. Even if there's a brief period after some balance patches where the meta is less rigid, we almost always end up back at another meta that's defined by one hero or one comp with minimal variation. And this poses a really interesting challenge to our question around balance. Because you're not forced to use the weaker heroes or play off meta, and everyone has access to the same tools for the most part, setting aside the fact that now you have to buy heroes sometimes, which sucks. Is it still a balance issue if the meta is rigidly stuck on, Kiriko, Lucio, Sojourn, Reaver, and Winston mirror matches? A lot of balance discussions center around an ability being either too strong or too weak, but if both teams are running the same heroes, doesn't that mean they're balanced? What if it's just a single hero like the Mercy Moth meta of the good old days? My position is that the meta is really just a consequence of that age-old problem of competitive games. Players will always try and optimize the fun out of a game if given the chance, and I think the meta just reflects the most optimal playstyle, even if it's not one that players actually want to play. I think there's also a bit of a difference between a hard meta and a soft meta, with the latter being a situation where there are definitely heroes that are stronger or weaker than others, but nothing that's objectively universally better, and the former being the situation where there are unquestionably heroes that, if your team doesn't have them, you are at a disadvantage. However, whether it's a hard or a soft meta, there's always still a tendency towards hegemony. Players will always be trying to find the superpowered team comp or hero that'll give them the extra edge, and once it's found, the meta sits until the developers shake things back up again. This also doesn't mean that a meta is inherently bad. I would argue it's neither good nor bad, it's just a neutral, functionally inevitable feature of a competitive game. If the core incentive of all participants in a scenario is to win, then of course they'll be incentivized to develop the most efficient strategy for winning. Maybe the question worth asking then is, why does this end up becoming such a problem for this type of game? Because I'm me and I can't help but make this overcomplicated, I'm going to steal a concept from international relations to try and help me explain this. Polarity. Polarity in the context of international relations is a way of understanding the distribution and concentration of power on a global scale. Global polarity can exist in one of three basic forms. Unipolarity, which is when a single country is indisputably dominant on the global stage. Bipolarity, which is when power is coalesced around two countries. And multipolarity, which is when at least three countries are roughly equally powerful in the world. Unipolarity involves a single country or bloc being dominant over the world to the extent that they're indisputably running the show. We currently live under unipolarity, with the Americans holding primacy on the global stage. Past examples of this would also include the Pax Britannica, or the British peace. This referenced an era of history where the British were similarly dominant on the global stage to the extent that they functioned as global police. In the context of this being an analogy for Overwatch, I would say that the Mercy meta is an era of unipolarity. A single hero who dominates the agenda and has far more power than anyone else. Unipolarity doesn't mean that literally everyone is on board or that everyone is equally invested in supporting the dominant power though, it just means that the dominant power is so strong, no one else is on its level. Bipolarity, by contrast, has two dominant powers rather than just one. The last time we experienced bipolarity was during the Cold War, where the Americans and USSR were the two poles of power. A big feature of bipolarity is that it's not enough to just run the show, you also need to have a team to back you up, and in the Cold War that would have been NATO and the Warsaw Pact for the US and USSR respectively. For our purposes of understanding Overwatch metas and balance, I would say that bipolarity reflects a situation where it's not just a single overpowered hero dominating the meta, but a whole team comp that's being enabled by or is focused on enabling a strong hero. I'll be fully honest with you, part of why this metaphor is fun and I've decided to run with it is that the logical conclusion of what I'm saying is that I'm arguing that GOATS is analogous to NATO, which I just think is extremely stupid and extremely funny, and I won't apologize for it. Tangent aside, the important thing to recognize is that under bipolarity, every element of each pole's network of alliances is important, not just the main character. Even if a single hero is the most responsible for enabling a meta comp or is the most impactful in it, they still need the whole team to be on board or else it falls apart pretty quickly. The Americans needed NATO, the USSR needed the Warsaw Pact, and GOATS needed Brigida. Multipolarity, as a final system to talk about, is when at least 3 countries or blocks are roughly on par with one another, although it does still mean that some countries are more powerful than others. This doesn't mean everyone is on the same level, just that there's more than 2. Multipolarity is kind of a catch-all that can include a lot of very different scenarios, but as a general rule, it just means that there are at least 3 distinct viable power players. The last time that we were in a state of multipolarity was from the beginning of World War I, which was the end of the Pax Britannica, to the end of World War II, which was the beginning of the Cold War. In the context of our ongoing messy Overwatch balance analogy, multipolarity would describe a meta where you can make a game work with a number of different heroes and comps at most levels of gameplay, and no individual hero or comp is inherently or immediately dominant over the game. It's a state of balance where there's no such thing as a hero that's like a must-pick on every map in terms of just the raw power they bring to the game. Like I said though, multipolarity in international relations doesn't mean that power is distributed equally. For a good chunk of the first half of the 20th century, multipolarity existed primarily between European powers like the UK, Russia, and Germany, plus more regional isolated powers like the US or Japan. Polarity is obviously a really complicated topic, just like anything in international relations, and I know I'm oversimplifying it here. There's not really a clear answer for which one is actually the best at achieving stability on the international stage, especially because power has a tendency towards monopoly that causes the systems to cycle. Multipolarity tends to lead to bipolarity, as blocks win or lose their power struggles until only 2 remain, and bipolarity tends to lead to unipolarity, as one of the 2 powers achieves dominance. Unipolarity, while it might seem like a natural endpoint, is just one stage in the cycle. Eventually other powers will try and catch up, where the dominant power will stumble under the weight of being the unipolar power, and the bigger they are, the harder they fall. When unipolarity ends, it tends to lead to multipolarity, at least temporarily, as the various powers try to capitalize on the rare opportunity to elevate themselves as global powers in this new cycle. Now, since I can read your minds and your comments in advance, I can already hear you saying, okay, that was a very entertaining and educational tangent, but what does any of that have to do with balance in Overwatch? And my answer is that I think we tend to see metas form in the same way, and that this can help us understand why developing a good state of balance for the game is so hard. A new balance patch will drop, and it'll break the old meta and will enter multipolarity as players try and figure out what the new meta might be. There are a bunch of heroes that people either know are strong or can make work in the chaos, and the community won't have reached consensus on what kind of a meta we're playing in. However, over time, the meta starts to settle. We start to see people figuring out which heroes and which team comps are able to deliver results, and we leave multipolarity for bipolarity as the viable team comps get developed. Sometimes this process for meta purposes stops at bipolarity, but sometimes the process will continue to identify a specific hero or occasionally like a specific duo who are the essential core of any team comp under the meta. When it comes to Overwatch, unipolarity and bipolarity tend to be the points where the meta feels stale. They're the metas with the least flexibility, and they're the stages of the meta most reliant on exploiting bad balance and being forced to acquiesce because otherwise you're at a disadvantage, and they tend to lead to stale gameplay. The reason this can be an issue is that, unlike multipolarity, where players are still being encouraged to try new things and explore different possibilities, the bipolar meta discourages it, and the unipolar meta effectively punishes you for it. And not only that, players can't do anything to end a unipolar or bipolar state from within the game. If you don't like the way the meta is playing out under multipolarity, or even very occasionally bipolarity in some instances, you can still try to find new ways to shift the meta or challenge the assumptions it operates under because they aren't necessarily fully solidified. And niche heroes in particular can often thrive in those environments as players are still working out the kinks in the emerging meta that niche heroes exploit. But once you're at unipolarity or a final stage of bipolarity, you don't have that freedom anymore. Outside of the handful of people who are notoriously good at playing off-meta heroes, you have to play ball or your own team will get tilted at you for refusing to play the heroes or comps that are widely recognized as being the best picks. In international relations, unipolarity tends to crack under its own weight. Being the dominant global power inherently involves burning a ton of resources on enforcing your status at the top and defending it from everyone else. Whether we're talking about the Pax Britannica or the Pax Americana, unipolarity places a lot of pressure on that dominant power to continuously exert authority and control, and unlike with multipolarity and bipolarity, there's no room to give. If the pressure causes a power to crack under multipolarity, then the surviving powers continue a multipolar system or advance to bipolarity. If one of the powers under bipolarity cracks, then it advances to unipolarity. But once you're at the top, there's only one power who's bearing the pressure, and there's nobody that they can push it off to. And eventually, what cannot bend will break. And this is the big difference between using this concept of polarity in international relations versus how I have bastardized it for this video. No amount of pressure from the players can reverse the tendency towards unipolarity within the context of the game. When it comes to polarity in the international system, the participants are the ones who determine polarity and can force a change that either concentrates or distributes power, at least in theory. But the participants in a meta can only determine polarity and force changes that concentrate power because their role is not as actors, but as reactors. The strongest hero or the strongest team comp already exists. Players just have to find them, but once they've found them, they can't unfind them. This is why it can be such a balance issue that players will always optimize the fun out of a game if given the opportunity. Even if everyone agrees it's not an enjoyable experience to play a particular meta, they can't just not play it because that's what's necessary to have the best shot of winning. It also artificially imposes success and failure in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect skill and doesn't pan over very well to the actual international relations understanding of polarity. If Sojourn is buffed and made more impactful than Ashe on average, then an Ashe player who's exactly as good as an equivalent Sojourn player will get worse results than the Sojourn. And then if a balance patch comes out and Sojourn gets a nerf and Ashe gets a buff to the point that the positions are reversed, then we'd expect to see the same problem happen in reverse. As metas become more codified and rigid as we move more away from multipolarity, Overwatch moves from a test of who is the best at Overwatch as a whole and into a test of which team has the best Sojourn, or who's the best at Sojourn, or which team is the best at running goats. This also leads us back to part 2. What kind of a game is Blizzard trying to make? Are they trying to make a game where goats should happen? If so, is it actually a problem when the meta naturally develops towards goats? Are they trying to make a game where Sojourn should run rampant? If so, doesn't Sojourn's strength reflect that the game is properly balanced based on their vision? And I think the answer is that this is deliberate. They want to be able to shake up the game in a way that's meant to stop it from getting too stale or too rigid, but they're also aware that metas are inevitable. Their balanced philosophy isn't centered on trying and failing to maintain a state of multipolarity. It's centered on an understanding that unipolarity and bipolarity are inevitabilities, and that their role as developers is to be there to crack metas when they start to get too stale without completely undermining the skill of people who've worked hard and gotten good under the previous meta. Is that something that they always succeed at, whether we're talking about Blizzard specifically or all games in general? And the answer is absolutely not. We can all point to metas where they moved too slow to crack it or were too scared to admit they'd made the mistake and tried to chip away at the problem in small chunks rather than swinging hard like they had to. Moth meta, Goats, Brigida, etc. are examples of times where the devs introduced something and it either slowly or quickly developed into a stale meta that Blizzard was too slow or too cautious in responding to. However, I really want to emphasize this isn't just me dunking on Blizzard for the sake of dunking on Blizzard. I get comments sometimes from people who are saying things like, well, if you could do it better, why not work for Blizzard and do it better then? And my response is usually just that people are allowed to critique things without having to be able to single-handedly fix everything. Although in some cases, like the issues I raised in my Contenders video, I probably could do it better, but that's beside the point. The point of this video is to examine why balancing a game like Overwatch is so hard. There are a ton of variables at play and a lot of conflicting incentives and motives that Blizzard has to try and juggle, and it is absolutely not something I envy them having to do. But that also doesn't mean that they don't deserve criticism for it, or that you're not allowed to be frustrated when a bad balance decision is made. At the end of the day, this is their job, and this is the product they're providing to you, the customer. The customer is not obligated to love a product just because someone else worked hard on it or had a difficult time developing it if the reality of the situation is that the product isn't what the customer expected or it isn't performing as advertised. They're also not required to do the producer's work by evaluating and providing constructive feedback for free. If Blizzard is not paying my bills, I am under no obligation to make a video explaining a balance issue and then solve it for them. This is part of what makes balance such a unique problem for video games as a whole, because they're not just competitions, they're products, and there are different incentives and different ways things are done in those two environments. Sure, a typical producer might iterate upon a product and develop a new and improved version, but trying to maintain balance in a competitive video game is a unique challenge that's inherently complicated and hard to get right, even temporarily, and that understanding what can make it so complicated can help us to understand why decisions get made the way they do. This video isn't about convincing you that Blizzard's incompetent or that Blizzard should be immune from criticism, because this is really hard. The goal here is only to try and get to the bottom of some of the many factors that can complicate the concept of balance in a competitive environment, and hopefully help people see a bigger picture when it comes to the topic, both for Overwatch and games in general. And I think that's where I'm going to end this one. If you enjoyed my spiral into overcomplicating a discussion of balance, be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that other good stuff the algorithm loves. Don't forget that members will be picking one of these 4 topics to become a video next month, so be sure to grab a $5 membership at youtube.com/@thevivros/join, or click the button down below. And you can find me on Twitch and Twitter under the username @thevivros for more gameplay and incoherent rambling respectively. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.